Good evening, everybody. So today we're going to be talking about a thing called compound inequalities. And this is a pretty complicated concept, but again, if you keep following the procedures that we've laid out the first three sections, it shouldn't be too difficult for you. If you're just going to repeat the process, more times, and it should be not too bad for you. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is what a compound inequality looks like. So what I've written on the board here so far are the graphs of a compound inequality. So to get to this point, we've already done some work, and the work is on the graph now, and then we're going to write the inequality from this, and then I'll show you how to get to the graph point. So the next slide will be the full process. I wanted to start with what your answers are going to look like. So what we look at here is what you might notice is that with a compound inequality, we actually have two dividing points, not just one. So here is a dividing point, and here is a dividing point. We are going to treat this the exact same way as we have all of the other ones. So the first thing we're going to do is we are only going to focus on this inequality right here and ignore that one completely. So if I asked you guys to write an inequality here, what you guys hopefully would do is on your dividing point, put your number, -7. Under the line, not the arrow, under the line, put your variable. So in this case, I'm going to use x. And if you do those two things, then we always use the less than symbol. And then I come back here and I notice that it's a dot, not a donut. It's filled in, and since it's filled in, that means I need the equal to sign. Okay? So that's the inequality for that part. Now I'm going to do the same process for this one over here. So under the dividing point, I put my number, which is 2. Under the line, not arrow, I put my variable, x. And if I do those two things, then I always use the less than symbol. So 2 is less than x for the left-hand side. So this is my answer. Both of the inequalities is the answer. So I get x is less than or equal to -7, or 2 is less than x. Okay, so those are my inequalities. Okay, so now take a look at the bottom one there. Again, it's similar in that it has two dividing points. There's one, and there's one. And so I'm going to, this time, do it by ignoring this dividing point. I'm just going to look at this dividing point. So if this dividing point weren't here, if that were an arrow instead, then I can write an inequality based on this one. So I do the process the same. Underneath the dividing point, I write my number, -20. Under my line, I put my variable. So under my line, I put my variable, so that's going to be my x. If I do those two things, I always use the less than symbol. So I use my less than symbol, and then I notice that this is a dot, not a donut. Therefore, it's going to be less than or equal to. Then I come over to my other point, and I'm now going to use this point for my inequality, and I'm going to ignore this thing over here. I've already handled that anyways. It's right there, so I'm going to use this point. So on this side, I say underneath my dividing point, I put my number, so -4. Underneath my line right here, there's the line, I put my variable, so that's an x, and what you notice is I already had an x there. So I don't need to rewrite the x. I wrote it on top of it because I only need one x. If I do that, then underneath there, like that, now I have the less than symbol, and again, I go back and look and see it's a dot, therefore it's going to be less than or equal to. So my answer ends up being, I'm going to rewrite it here so we can see it a little easier. Off to the side, it's going to be -20 less than or equal to x is less than or equal to -4. So this would be my final answer. You don't have to write the x twice. The x is being used for both this dot and this dot because that's where the line is. This line right here is that x. Okay? So there we go. That's the basics from a graph. Now let's take a look at the entire process. So we have this problem here. It looks like it's two different equations, but this is actually one problem. All right. So we're going to do it just like we've been doing in the past. We're going to solve. The very first thing we do is find our dividing point, or actually, the first thing we do is we're going to change to an equal sign. I did notice a few people today not changing to an equal sign. Strongly encourage you do that so that as the problems get more difficult, you don't have to learn a new process. You just keep repeating the same process you already know. So there we go. So the first thing I do is change my equal sign. Then I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. I get 2x equals 6, and then divide both sides by 2. So I get x equals 3. Hopefully I did that correctly. And so what I just found there is my dividing point. But as we know with compound inequalities, I don't have one dividing point. I have 2 dividing points. So I'm going to do the same process over here. 3x minus 6 is equal to 12. Add 6 to both sides. 3x is equal to 18, and divide both sides by 3 so that x is equal to 6. And there is my second dividing point. All right, now I'm ready to plot my graph. So I draw my graph. As usual, the only thing I care about is where is it compared to 0. So there's 0. And my first dividing point right here is 3. So that would be like that. My second dividing point here is 6. So that's going to be to the right of 3. So that would be somewhere over here. Okay. Now, above each dividing point, I put the dot or donut. So I look up here and I notice that that's going to be a donut. So I put a donut in. I look up here and I see that that's going to be a donut right there. So I put my donut in there. So 2 donuts. It doesn't always have to be donuts. They can be different. One can be a donut, one can be a dot. No big deal. All right, now, typically what we do next is we test a point, right? And what I've been telling you is great to do is to test 0. Although on this one, I'm not going to test 0. The reason I'm not going to test 0 is because 0 is outside of my 2 points. When I have compound inequalities, this is hopefully something you guys are writing down. When I have compound inequalities, the easiest way to do it is to test a point in the middle. Okay, test a point in the middle. If I test a point between 3 and 6, and if it's true for this one, then it's also true for that one. If I test this point in between here and it's false for this one, then it's also false for that one. So I can test a point in the middle and it will immediately tell me where my trues are for all of them. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and test 0. Actually, no, I'm not. I'm not going to test 0. I'm going to go ahead and test, let's say I test 4. That's in between. Okay, so I'm going to test 4. So I go 2 times 4 plus 3, and now I use my inequality symbol, is less than 9. 8 plus 3 is less than 9. 11 is less than 9. So what that means is that this 4 is false. If this 4 is false, then that means the other side of my red dividing point must be true. I also noticed a few people are not writing true and false like I am. I strongly encourage you to do that until you've got this down perfectly, because our arrow is always going to go towards the true side. Now, so what I said a second ago is that if this is false for this point, I'm saying this is 4 is also going to be false for that point. I'm going to prove that right now. But what I'm saying is that if I test this point over here for this red one, I test the number 4 and it's false, then that means it's also going to be false for the green one. Okay, that's what I think. All right, so let me go ahead and test it. And so then I have 3 times 4 minus 6 is greater than 12. 12 minus 6 is greater than 12. 6 is greater than 12. That is false, which means for this green point right, for this green point right here, this number is false, which is what I expected. So if this side over here is false, that means that this side must be true. And that's always going to be the case. You will either have trues on the outside of your points like this and nothing in the middle, or you will have false on the outside of your points and the trues will be in the middle. So now I'm ready to draw my line. So my line is going to go like this and like that. The last thing I need to do is to do my my inequalities. So I'm going to, wow, I gotta sneak this in somewhere. I'm going to, hopefully you guys have more room than I have. I'm gonna erase, I'm sorry, I'm gonna erase the false symbol. Oops, sorry. I'm going to erase the false symbol right here, and I'm going to erase this over here as well, so I got some room to write. Okay, so underneath my line I put my x, underneath my dividing point I put my 3. If I do that, I always use the less than symbol, and I don't need to use the equal to because it's an open dot. Underneath my dividing point, I put 6. Underneath my line, I put my x, and then I use the less than symbol. Here's a perfect example of why we change it to an equal sign. Right here, let's change to an equal sign because look at this. If you keep the greater than symbol, you're actually going to get the wrong answer. You don't get 6 is less than x, which is what you should have gotten. So this is a perfect example of why I like to change it to an equal sign and then test to get the right answer. So remember, the green then is my answer. All of the green is the solution. Okay? All right. One last problem here. And this is a similar problem in that it's a compound inequalities, but again, it looks a little bit different. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to ignore this side completely. I don't care about this side right here, and I'm just going to solve this as if it was all by itself. So my first step is to say -1 equals 5t plus 2. And notice I do not write this down. I don't care about that. I only write down this part right here. All right? So now I solve that, and I subtract 2 from both sides, and I get -3 equals 5t, divide by 5. So -3/5, that's horrific. Let me try that again. -3/5 is equal to t. And I just found my dividing point. Okay, I just found the red dividing point. I'm going to do the same thing, but for this one, I'm going to use this part of the line, and I'm going to ignore this. So I just do this in 2 different steps. That's all I do. So I say 5t plus 2 is less than 4. Oh, no, I don't. What did I do wrong? Hopefully you caught it. I should say is equal to 4. Now I subtract 2 from both sides. I get 5t equals 2. Divide both sides by 5. And I get t is equal to 2/5. And I just found my blue dividing point. Okay, now I have my 2 dividing points, so now I'm ready to graph my line. So I'm going to graph it here, and I go like this. Okay, and I put in my 0 so I have some perspective there. And now what I don't care about is how far over on these lines they are. All I care about is that my red dividing point needs to be to the left of 0, so that's -3/5. That's to the left of 0. And my blue dividing point needs to be to the right of 0, so that's 2/5 like that. Okay, so now I need to put in my dots and my donuts, and I come back here and I look at this and I see that is going to be a dot. Put in my dot, and I come over here and I look at that and I see that one's going to be a donut. I mentioned a minute ago that you don't have to have the same, you can have 1 dot and 1 donut. I'm going to redo that so it's a little bit better. Donut. There, whoops. There we go. Okay, so there we go. Now I got my dots and my donuts. So the next thing I have to do is test a point. And I mentioned a minute ago that I always want to test a point that is in between these two. Okay, if I can test 0, I will. The last one I couldn't. This one, it's okay for me to test 0 because 0 is in between my 2 dividing points. It makes it easier. So I'm going to go ahead and test 0. So I have -1 is less than or equal to 5 times 0 plus 2. So this is negative 1 is less than or equal to 2. And that is true. So what I'm saying then is that I think that the blue point right here is going to be true as well, because I think the inside of this is true. And we'll see what I get over here. So I have 5 times 0 plus 2 is less than 4. 2 is less than 4, which is true. So it is true. So they're both true. So that means that the lines go like this. They are connected. They do not go past each point. So at this point right here, this line stops. From this point here, this line stops. It does not keep going. So those are the endpoints. Now the last thing I have to do is to write my inequality. So for my inequality, I am going to do the same thing I've done before. Here I have negative 3/5. Underneath the line, I write my variable, which is x. And underneath this dividing point, I write 2/5. And under the dividing point, I wrote my arrow, wrote my x. That means I used the less than symbol. And this one, it's equal to. Underneath the line, I wrote my x. And on my dividing point over here, I wrote my variable, or my 2/5. That means that this is going to be less than. And this is the solution right here. That's it. Okay, so that is compound inequalities. It's not that much different. I just break it up into two problems, graph them independently, and you should always get the same type of graphs. Okay? All right, see you guys tomorrow.